So we've looked at the conversational stack, and like I said earlier, that through just natural conversation we can naturally go into a gospel conversation or talk about spiritual things, and sometimes it needs a bit of a push. And so what we're going to look at now is actually how to have a spiritual conversation. And we're going to, you can use these principles or these questions in any situation, but we're going to use it in the context of you going up to speak to someone that you don't know about, spiritual things. So these questions are really helpful. So first of all, you need to have questions or statements that get the person to think. And it's really important to have these prepared in advance. If you try and think on the go, then most likely your mind will go blank and you won't know what to say. So practice makes perfect, if you practice the right way or the perfect things. So, remember, as we're sharing with people, as we go to share and talk about spiritual things, it's important to listen carefully to people's answers, because this will help shape our gospel presentation and enable us to focus on what's most important so that it can be a greater blessing to them. First of all, when it comes to starting a spiritual conversation, if you were going cold turkey, you were out on the streets, or you met someone and you wanted to share Christ with them without having to spend some time building a relationship with them. And sometimes that's really necessary, particularly if you're on the streets. If you just go and start with common conversation, then what happens is they're really suspicious of you. They're thinking, who is this person and what does he want? Because it's kind of not normal for strangers just to start chatting about all sorts of different things. So when you go to connect with a person, say like on the streets in that kind of context, you need to be upfront with them straight away. It puts them at ease, they know who you are, what you're doing, and then you can go from there. Doesn't mean that you have to talk about the gospel straight away, but what it does give you, it gives you the ability to relax, and helps them to relax as well. So, first of all, when you go to start a spiritual conversation with someone, if you haven't started with common conversation because you're in a different environment than social party or work or something like that, you need to introduce yourself. You start off with who you are and what you're doing, because this puts their mind at ease. Otherwise, they might think you're some salesperson. They might think you're some nutter. I remember going up to people and I would start with common conversation, and then as soon as I bring Christianity in, like maybe about 10, 15 minutes later, their walls went up because they thought, that's what you're after. I was wondering what you're angling at. And so, their suspicions were confirmed and they thought that we were being underhanded. So nail your colours to the mast and just explain who you are and what you're doing. And that will put their mind at ease. Now there's creative ways to do that. Sometimes you introduce, say, hi, my name's Jeremy and this is so-and-so, and then you explain what you're doing. We're just a couple of Christians going around finding out what people think about whatever it is. So when you introduce yourself and what you're doing, it puts everybody's mind at ease. And there is no pretense there. So, once you've introduced yourself and what you're doing, what do you say next? Well, you need to have a thing we call of diagnostic questions. And you need at least 3. And the reason we have 3 is because sometimes 1 isn't enough. Everybody is at different places with their understanding of God, on their journey of who God is in their own mind, how they relate with God, and whether they care about God or not. So 1 question does not rule them all. And so you have like a couple of questions just in case 1 question does not open up a conversation. Now, these diagnostic questions have to be open-ended questions. They're better to be open-ended. You can have closed-ended questions, but just remember, if you do, then you need to make sure you've got other questions to help you further in the conversation. So, what I want you to do now is I want you to just pause the video and just think and write down as many questions as you can of how you could start a spiritual conversation. They can be open or close-ended, but really you want to work on open-ended questions. But if you know a close-ended question like, do you go to church, or are you a spiritual person? Write it down, and maybe you can think about it some more of how to make that as an open-ended question, a fat question. So some questions could be, what do you think the purpose of life is? What is a real Christian? How did the world begin? What happens to us when we die? Who do you think Jesus is? See if you can come up with some more questions. Okay, now you've got your questions. What I want you to do is I want you to tell me what your questions are. Now, are they open-ended questions? Do they lead to a natural conversation? Now, with your 3 questions, the first question you need to make it the most general. So, for example, a general question is, what do you think the purpose of life is? Now, you're not talking about a specific religion. You're not talking about a specific person. You're talking about something general that's applicable to us all. What do you think the purpose of life is? Why do you think we're here? That is the number one question people want answered. And we should be able to answer that question, because actually the gospel does answer that question, because the author of creation has given us a purpose. So you wanted something general. Have you had any spiritual experiences, or what spiritual experiences have you had? You're not saying, are you a spiritual person? If you do say, are you a spiritual person, they say no, you can say, why not? Or yes, or what kind of spiritual experiences you've had. So that's how you can, create depth to a close-ended question. What sort of spiritual experiences have you had? I'm a spiritual person, I'm a Christian, my name's Jeremy, I'm a Christian, spiritual person, and we're going out and just finding out what kind of spiritual experiences people have had. What are some of yours? And so that way, you're not like leaning towards, you're not solely focused on Christianity. What you're doing, these diagnostic questions are really important, because what you're doing is you're getting to know the person, you're getting to understand who they are and what they believe. Another good question to start off with is, what do you think God's like? Some people would use the question, do you believe in God? Again, that's a closed question. Yes, no. If they say no, you can say, why don't you believe in God? If they say yes, you can say, well, what have you come to understand about who God is? So that's like 3 questions. That's a lot to remember. So you could just start with one question and say, my name's Jeremy, going around asking people their thoughts about who God is. Well, what are your thoughts? And that way, they can tell you as much information about their belief about God, or as little as they want. Remember, I was talking to 2 ladies in their mid-20s, and they were at the bus stop in Lower Hutt, and I said, I'm just going around, I'm just a friendly Christian going around asking people who they think, what they think God is like. And they had no idea. They said, we don't know. I was like, and they had no Christian contact with anybody in their whole lives. They never had any contact with the Bible, and they knew nothing. And so as we're talking, they asked me, well, what do you think God is like? And I was able to share what God was like. Now, it's really important when you ask a question like this, what do you think God is like? And if they say something that is contrary to the Bible, do not shoot them down. Do not stop the conversation or hinder the conversation by then beginning to tell them who God is and what the Bible says. They might be Muslim and they say, I believe that Allah is God, and then you don't stop and say, well, Allah is a false God and this and that, and shoot them down. At this point in the conversation, you're not there to correct them, you're there to find out what they believe. so that you can better understand who they are and where they're at with God, so you can better witness to them. See, he who saves souls is wise. So, you need to be able to know where a person's at before you can help them to get closer to Jesus. You don't assume they're at a certain place. For example, we were in a few years ago, the V8 supercars were in Hamilton, and we were doing some bus evangelism. So we jumped on the bus. The bus would take us around the city for one price and just go round and round until you got off. And so for a couple of hours we're sitting on the bus, and people would come and sit down on the bus, and we would strike up a conversation with them and try and share the gospel with them. And so this one Māori guy is sort of like in his 30s, came, sat down, and one of our team members was with him, a great guy, very passionate, loves Jesus, and asked him, my name is so-and-so, we're doing this, we're Christians, and we're just asking people what they think God is like. Who is God? And the guy says, I don't believe in God. And then for the next 5 minutes, my mate began to give evidence after evidence of why God exists. And as I was sitting a few seats in front of him, I was just listening to the conversation, and within 5 or 10 minutes, the conversation died a natural death. Because the more evidence he gave, the more this guy seemed to just shut down and not be interested. And then there was this silence. And so I waited about 10 minutes. And I just turned around after about 10 minutes or so. And I said, sorry to bother you, I'm with this guy. We're friends, and we're part of the team. I just want to ask you a question. So, why don't you believe in God? And his answer astounded me. He said, well, I grew up in a Christian family. In fact, my father was a minister. But he was a hypocrite, because everything that he preached his congregation to, he did the opposite. He would beat my mum. He was a drunk. He was involved in drugs. And he used to beat us kids. And so he would talk about love, and then he would come back, and that night he would beat us. And he would abuse verbally and physically abuse our mum. And we hated him for it. So if that's God, if God is in that, then I don't want anything to do with him. Do you see what he said? It's not that he didn't believe in God, but he had such a bad experience. He couldn't reconcile the thought of, well, if God's real, I don't want anything to do with him, because that's his followers. So it wasn't a question of science or anything like that. It was about a personal experience. And I began to talk to him about who Jesus is and what he stood for. And asked him questions like, do you think that his father was honouring Jesus through his actions and attitudes? And I got to share about who Jesus really was. Because he had a very poor model growing up. And I got to pray with him. And as we conversed, he became more and more open. And then he got off the bus, and he was thanking me for the conversation. All because I just didn't take the first thing he said and stop and try and corrected him. I tried to understand where he was at and why he believed what he believed. And I was able to actually minister to him at his point of need. I was able to meet with him where he was at, not where I thought he was at. Because you can only meet people where they're at. You can't want them to be somewhere else and try and start from there. And when you ask questions, that helps us to get a clear picture of where people are at in their understanding and their relationship with God. So you have 3 questions. So you start off with the most general. God, what is God like? How was the world created? What is the purpose of life? And the second one can be a little bit more focused. It could be something like, who is Jesus? Where do we find the purpose of life? Do we find the purpose of life in religion? How can we have a connection with this God? If you're talking about who God is. Again, you're becoming more narrow in your focus, and you're trying to bring them to a place where we want to completely talk about Christianity, but we're trying to do it in a natural way and make sure that we're having dialogue, not monologue. What is the church's purpose in helping us to find the purpose of life? And the third question is where you would be the most specific and applicable to them, the most hard-hitting. Things like, what do you think happens to us when we die? How does a person have a relationship with Jesus? How does a person have their sin forgiven? How do we live out our purpose of life? Things like that. So you start from the most general, and then you work your way to more specifics like the Bible, Christ, heaven, hell, life after death, things like that. And so these are your diagnostic questions. So they're diagnostic questions because they help you to find out where the person's at, and so that you can be able to best minister to them. So what I want you to do is I want you to find someone. You've got your 3 questions. And I want you to ask, it could be a spouse, a friend, Christian, and do a bit of a role play with them. And see if you can ask them to be a non-Christian that's open to the gospel, not trying to stop you so that you can help, and ask these questions and get them to answer them. And if you get stuck, remember the conversational expanders. So just so that you're getting used to asking questions, because when it comes to witnessing, a lot of us are not used to asking questions. We're actually used to giving the answers before even the questions are asked. And Jesus was a master at asking questions. And when someone would ask him a question, what would he do? He would ask a question of the question. Why? Because questions are powerful. It means that we have a dialogue, and it actually reveals to us where the person's truly at. So, you have your diagnostic questions. So what happens next? Because you haven't really shared the gospel, you're just talking about spiritual truth. You need 2 transitional questions. The first one, can I tell you how I? So you're talking about the purpose of life. Let's just say, for example, you're talking about one of your questions, and we'll just say the purpose of life for the sake of argument. And so you're talking about what is the purpose of life, how do we find it, how does the role religion plays or Christianity plays in finding the purpose of life, what happens to us, etc., so forth. And so your transitional question to get into the gospel, or to bridge from the spiritual conversation to a gospel conversation, is this: can I tell you how I come to find my purpose in life? You need to ask them permission, because some people in some cultures, they'll just if they're not interested, they'll let you just continue to talk, because it's rude to say, I don't want to listen to you. Now, a lot of Kiwis, if they don't want to listen, they'll tell you. But different cultures, there are different levels of respect and expressions of that. So, if you're talking about, who is Jesus? Can I tell you how I came to know who Jesus really was? And then they say yes, you share your story, your testimony. And you talk about how God became real to you. If your last question is, what happens to us when we die, or do you think we go to heaven when we die? Or will we go to heaven when we die, or what happens to us when we die? You can say, can I tell you how I know when I die I'll go to heaven? So you're using this transitional question for the bridge from your spiritual conversation to becoming more focused and heading towards the gospel. Remember, your testimony is not the gospel unless you put the gospel in it. But you just want to share your story of how God became real to you so that they can see God working through your life. And then you share your testimony. Now, in your notes, there is a whole section of testimony and how to create a good one, do's and don'ts. Also, questions for you to answer to help clarify things in your mind. In your own time, go through that. Put your testimony together. Write it. Go through that whole process, because your story is an important tool to helping people see the reality of God and at work in our community. God of the universe broke into your life and made himself real to you and has helped you in so many ways. And so when you share your story, that shows people how God can help them in their life. And remember, a good testimony is not about how bad you were and how good you are today. A good testimony is some of the things that you struggle with and how God has helped you with those struggles. How God has made himself real to you in those circumstances. Remember, a good testimony is not about how bad you used to be and how good you are now. It's about your life, where you're at, and how God became real to you. So, can I tell you how I found the purpose of life? Can I tell you how I found, how I came to know the Bible was true? Can I tell you how I found out how to have a relationship with Jesus? And then you share your testimony. See, you ask them permission. You don't assume permission. But you can guarantee 9 times out of 10 they'll say yes if they've tracked with you this far. Because if they weren't spiritually open, they wouldn't have a conversation with you about spiritual things. And maybe they're open with you, but they just got no time and they have to get to work or something like that. And so they might say, "No, I've got to go." And then you could, if they have to go, you can just say to them, "Well, maybe we can catch up some other time. Would you be interested?" And that might lead to another opportunity. So what happens after you've shared your testimony? The final transitional question, and this transitions us from sharing our story to sharing his story. And again, you want to connect the question to the topic you're talking about. Can I show you what God did so you can live out your purpose? Can I show you what God did so that you could know Jesus? Can I show you what God did for you so that you can have an assurance you'll go to heaven? And then you share the gospel. And you see God's story, what God did. It's not about you, it's about everything about He did. And we're going to get into the gospel and what is the gospel message. So this is just a simple outline to help you to have spiritual conversations about spiritual topics and naturally lead it into a gospel conversation. And the thing is if you're talking with someone that you in a social setting, you can add some of that. You can throw in any of these diagnostic questions that you have at any time in the course of the conversation, and then you can go through this process. But the thing is if you don't know where to go, you won't go anywhere. But if you've got a basic idea in your mind of what to say and where to go, then you've got a lot more confidence, and you'll see a lot more opportunities to actually share the gospel with people. There are so many opportunities. People are so open to talking about spiritual things. But often we don't take them because we don't really know what to say. So please, use these things. Practice these things so that you can become proficient at having a spiritual conversation with anybody at any time if the opportunity arises. I had one friend of mine, he was doing this training, and he didn't do too well at school, and he would just practice in the mirror everything or some of the things that we've been talking about in these lectures. And he was phenomenal at sharing the gospel with people. Why? Because he took the time to train himself in the way of being able to share the gospel. What to say, how to say it. He just practiced. Remember, poor preparation leads to poor performance. And so we need to put in the work, because God does not bless lazy Christians, because laziness is a sin. But He will bless us if we lean on Him and we put in the work ourselves. So next up, we're going to look at the gospel. And what is the gospel and how we can communicate it in a simple yet effective way that is not only verbal but visual as well.